exciting presentation. Exciting might be the wrong description for this, but a very useful presentation today that is going to provide you with practical guidance to consider, with respect to legal implications that you need to consider to successfully reopen your business. My name is Jason Castor. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for Parsons, Bailey & Latimer. And joining me today are my colleagues, Sean Monson, who chairs the firm's Employment and Labor Department, Susan Mott-Schiedler, and Christina Jepson, who are going to go through a very substantive presentation with really practical guidelines that are going to help you navigate these really tricky times that we're all in. Before we get into the presentation, I just want to touch base on the format. All lines will be muted, but we will take Q&A as well as we can through the Q&A function. If we can't address your questions through the webinar today, we will do our best to address those offline. This webinar is being recorded, and at the conclusion of the webinar, a link along with our slide presentation that we've prepared today will be shared with you. Before we get into the presentation, I must say that we have to start with a legal disclaimer. It wouldn't be right if a law firm didn't have a disclaimer before it started its presentation. But our presentation today should be considered a source of general information and should not be considered as legal advice. If you have any questions about how this information relates to your business, you must consult with your legal counsel. And so with that, I am now going to turn the time over to Sean Monson, who's going to kick off today's presentation. Sean?
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone for participating in today's webinar. I'm not saying anything that you don't know when I say that the world has changed dramatically since Rudy Gobert was tested positive for COVID-19 in Oklahoma City. It seemed like that was the first domino that fell and led to the incredible reaction of shutting down businesses, shutting down business activity. That was the first step, and the world has obviously changed significantly since then. But for employers and businesses, one way that the world has not changed, and that is that you have two overriding concerns about how to operate your business. The first concern is managing risk. And I've been doing employment law for over 24 years, and that's kind of one of the primary functions that I've had and I've consulted with the businesses about is how do you manage risk? The second concern that employers and companies have about is how to make sure that my employees can feel safe in the work environment so they can be efficient, and how do I make sure that my customers feel safe in the workplace so they are willing to buy my products and buy my services. And those are, as we've been dealing with a whole slew of information and changes in the law, with new statutes being passed by Congress, and trying to figure out what those mean for each one of us. Those two overriding concerns, I think, are kind of what hover above everything. That is, again, how do we make sure that we manage risk, and how do we make sure that we have employees and customers that can feel comfortable and safe coming into our work environment, so that in the case of employees, they can work efficiently. In the case of customers, they're interested in buying our products and services. So today we're going to talk about essentially how to manage that risk and how to create an environment where employees or customers could potentially feel comfortable to come to our business. And how do we go about doing that now that with the restrictions are beginning to be lessened to a certain degree in Utah. So Susan Mott-Schiedler is going to talk about creating a plan, which is something that every single employer must do. It's the key to this whole process. Christina Jepson is going to talk about temperature testing and other symptom checking for employees before they come back to work, as well as how to protect vulnerable populations. And I'm going to talk about following local guidance, such as guidance that's been issued by the CDC, Osha, and then what to do if you have an employee who actually has COVID-19. How do you respond, and how do you handle that? So that's kind of the framework. And again, I think I wanted to just make sure that you think about the broader picture, and that is, how am I going to manage risk in this environment, and how am I going to make my employees and my customers feel safe? Because you can get bogged down in the minutia, and that's kind of what has been pressing on each one of us the last few weeks, but I want to kind of we want to take a more global perspective about this approach and how you go about reopening your business and can be successful. There's going to be winners and there's going to be losers as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic in business. And in my view, the winners are going to be those companies that adapt and are proactive in responding to COVID-19. And that's kind of part of what we're trying to help you think about in this presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan to talk about creating a plan.
Thank you, Sean. So when you create a plan, there are a number of overarching considerations that should guide you, both when you're trying to figure out how to open, what your opening is going to look like, and then you should consider this as a living document, as a plan that is potentially going to keep changing as COVID-19 evolves, as our conditions in the state change, as your local conditions change. The first thing you want to talk or think about is tone from the top. So the success of this plan to some degree is going to be controlled by the tone from the top. If you are going to require masks, for example, make sure that your supervisors, your C-suite people, your execs are also wearing masks, that they're not resisting, that they're not like two sets of rules. So make sure that everyone is going to be following the rules and that you're going to be able to do that. Second is communication. And this is a little bit also toned from the top. Think about how frequently do you want to communicate? You're going to need to, in the beginning, this is a change in the workplace. There are a number of things in our lives on a daily basis that are changing anyway. So I think these are major changes for people. You're going to have to communicate pretty frequently in the beginning. Even before you open, you might want to consider starting that communication. Hi, here's what we're thinking about doing. Here's some of the things we're thinking about implementing, to allow your employees to prepare for that, whether it's buying masks for themselves or just thinking about what work is going to look like in the new world. You want to think about the type of communication. So written communication, so emails, for example, to your employees. And these are helpful as the first few weeks that you open. Reminders, some people communicate better in writing than in oral situations. You want to think about what kind of oral communications you're going to have. So phone calls, Zoom meetings, that sort of thing. Team meetings, so smaller kind of huddles. I'll talk about this a little bit more. Daily huddles where you talk about issues that are coming up with the plan, interactions, that sort of thing. And then you want to think about policies that you're going to have. Who are you going to communicate this to? So employees, customers, vendors, and then who is going to be doing the communication? Initially, I think you should have a lot of top heavy communication coming down, so that it is the word of the company. And you want to appoint a COVID-19 workplace coordinator. And that person's going to be in charge of, it can be just policies, leave policies, or it can be an expanded position. This is more sort of a human resource probably position, but you want everybody to go through this person with all their considerations. And everyone knows that this person is the COVID-19 workplace coordinator. If employees have questions, they can go to this person. If managers have questions, they can go to this person. If there are issues, they go to this person. You also want to think about documentation issues in opening and what this looks like. So I would assign the documentation to specific employees. And when we get to talking about the things that we're going to need to document, make it part of their job duties. So if a person is running a huddle in the morning, they're going to be the one that's in charge, or they're going to dictate who is in charge of recording what was talked about, who was there, that sort of thing. Who is in charge of implementing policies, making sure they're signed, that sort of thing. Some of these fall under human resources. Some of these are going to be new duties. You want to document when and how decisions were made. So for example, when you are deciding who to bring back, you want to make sure that that is documented so that there's no question later. And oftentimes these things move pretty quickly, particularly as COVID-19 evolves or as your plan evolves a little bit. Make sure that these are documented, because sometimes it's hard to go back and remember how decisions were made. You'll have confidentiality concerns. So if you do plan to, say, implement temperature tests or temperature taking, that if you make a written record of that, that you set that aside in a confidential protected file that only people who need to know have access to, and that's separate from any sort of HR file. And then records of attendance. And this is not an hour, wage and hour concern. This is if you need to go back and trace who was in the workplace at a specific time, or even vendors who were there. If you need, make sure you have a vendor sign-in log established if you don't already. So that if you do need to contact trace, you can go back and see very easily, oh, who was there? Like who was there during this employee's or this vendor's time of illness? Next slide. You need to consider the resources and guidance available, and Sean will talk about this a little bit. There's federal, state, and local, and then also industry and trade guidance. The CDC, OSHA, and EEOC are your big federal. Then there's an overlay of state and county orders. There's some city orders. And your industry and trade may also have very specific guidelines for opening up and suggestions for how to do that safely. And then the plan itself, I say, address the 3 Ps: physical space, people, and policies. And the physical space is probably going to dictate people and policies to some degree. Next slide. So when you're thinking about your physical space, this is how do I minimize the risk that this is going to spread in my workplace? Let's say someone who is asymptomatic comes in, and how do we try to minimize the risk that that person is going to spread it to other people? So I suggest that you walk through, as an employee does, walk through the workplace or a vendor or customer from the parking lot into the office. And so what points does that person have to walk through? And you should think about cleaning concerns, congregating concerns, and spacing concerns between people. So for example, when I walk to work or when I come up from the elevator, there's a stairwell. So there's, could be a lot of people in it, maybe not. Then I get to the primary elevator. And so one thing you want to consider is talking to your landlord, or if you are the landlord, talking to your other tenants about how you're going to deal with some of these issues. So the elevator is a concern, because for a while we may only have 1 or 2 people in the elevator at a time. So how are you going to deal with that? That's a congregating point. People are in a small little space that they're going to be together for a while waiting for another elevator. A way you could deal with that, for example, is to stagger arrival time so that not everyone is getting there at 9 o'clock. Is everyone swiping in or badging in at the same clock at the same time? You could allow people to log in different places. You can allow them, again, to stagger, that sort of thing. Break rooms, bathrooms, all of these, kitchens, all of these are concerns because people do tend to congregate and talk in these places. Secretaries' desks is another place. And, depending on what sort of, or maybe your hostess or whatever, there's a level that people touch with their hands, they're breathing on it, they're coughing on it. So what are you going to do to discourage that? Stairwells, the copier rooms, supply rooms, all of these are kind of pinch points or where people touch a lot of things. And then you want to identify spacing concerns. And in a desk and cubicle situation, this is fairly easy, or where there's a counter and people are face to face. But office spacing, so when you're thinking about, for example, schedules of your employees, perhaps you could schedule people who are right next to each other on 2 different days, so that there are fewer people working close together in your office, or your space, whatever that may be, or maybe you move them further apart, you have more barriers in between, that sort of thing. Work floors, maybe you bring different floors back. Stairwells, that sort of thing. You want to create a protocol for addressing the issues. Barriers, like we're seeing now everywhere, the glass barriers with something to pass under. That could be secretaries' desks, that could be between cubicles, checkouts, ordering, where things, food or coffee is delivered, that sort of thing. One person at a time, one-way aisles, more cordoning off. You've seen, people put spots on the floor, tape 6 feet spacing, that sort of thing. You want to change your cleaning protocols and make sure that you have the supplies ahead of time. So as you're thinking about this, go ahead and order this stuff. Cleaning supplies, if you're going to do masks, that sort of thing, and you're going to need more of it than you typically do. You want to decide what type of rules you're going to put in. Is everyone going to have to clean the copier after they use it? Kitchen, is there going to be one person in the kitchen at a time, one person in the bathroom at a time? And that might be easier with the types of facilities you have. Maybe only one person fits in the bathroom, So hiring additional cleaners during the day is a potential way to deal with this. Making employees responsible for their own space if they have it. So, phone, keyboard, that sort of thing, and making sure that you're very clear that you don't share desk phones, and so that there's less sharing of that. Make sure that you think about the placement of the safety items. So when your cleaning person walks through, they know sanitizer should be in these places, and that there's disposal for safety items. Everyone has, if they're going to change their masks out, or if everyone has gloves, that's another training issue, is you're going to have to teach people how to take off gloves. But make sure that there's a garbage can that's not overflowing. So you might need to put bigger garbage cans in different spaces. You might want to consider putting a garbage can by the bathroom door, for example, so people can take a paper towel and either open the door and then throw it away, or open the door when they're leaving and throw it away. Another good idea while all this cleaning is going on is removing knickknacks. And so I think about, secretaries' desks, for example, where I work, they're up high. Lots of people have knickknacks up there. Those are all items that are going to need to be cleaned. They're at kind of breath height. This is probably the time to just take that stuff away for a while. Pictures, that sort of thing. Unused furniture. So let's say that you do have furniture that is not really used that much and no one ever uses it, but you're still going to have to clean it. So now might be the time to put that in storage, or if you have, a spare room, any kind of storage space, putting things that you don't use in that space so that you don't have to waste the time and money to clean them. And then this one is going to make a lot of people either happy or very sad, but there's going to be no more open grazing for a while. Buffets, everyone comes to the same point to pick up food, or the tray of food that mysteriously appears in the kitchen post-meeting, bagels with cream cheese, none of that. There's a possibility that you could do little single servings and that sort of thing, but really we might be encouraging people to bring their own food if they need to, that sort of thing, and no candy bowls. So, that's, people are putting their hands in there, touching it. Now is not the time for that. And then, like I said before, involve your landlord and other involved parties. And so that could be vendors, see what they're doing, communicate to the vendors what it is we're doing. Make sure that the landlord is having also appropriate safety measures. So you don't want to, for example, have everyone required to wear masks, but no one else in your whole building is. That sort of thing. Make sure your cleaning crews are wearing masks, that sort of thing. And so then the second P is people. And this is employees, vendors, customers, anyone who is served by your business, who works at your business, or who serves your business. So who's going to come back? Are you going to allow, and aside from employees, are you going to allow your vendors back immediately or not? Customers, what's the communication to them going to look like? For the employees, how are you going to decide who comes back? Are you going to ask for volunteers if you don't plan on a full opening? Are you going to do it by business groups? So, okay, it makes sense to open this part of our business first, but we're not going to need this other group as much. Are you going to stagger them based on job duties? Or another consideration, guidance from federal or state level. You want to think about protection of vulnerable groups here, and asking for volunteers could deal with that. If you do know that you have vulnerable groups, how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to let them work from home a little bit longer? Are you going to have staggered, some people work in the office, have sort of a safe place for that person to be if they need office. Another thing you want to do is think about discrimination concerns. And here's documentation goes a long way here. Make sure that you're not bringing, an unprotected class back while the protected class all gets to stay at home, that sort of thing, or doesn't get to come back to work and get a paycheck, that sort of thing. And how are you going to apply this to vendors and customers? When you're going to bring them back is another concern, or something you have to decide. Is it going to be job duty function that dictates that, guidance from authorities, how long it takes to install safety measures, or to figure out what kind of safety measures you even need? As I said, staggered schedules are a way to keep fewer people in. And this is really thinking about more office. For more service-oriented industries, physical barriers are going to be probably more where your head is at. But can people still continue in that type of environment working from home, for example? What are you going to require from your employees? Are you going to require testing to come back to work, notification of exposure? And that's a policy, obviously. Are you going to require safety gear? So masks, gloves, what kind of cleaning requirements? And those types of things, is like face covering and gloves, are going to require a lot of training. So you don't want people who have gloves, and the idea is that that's the dirty part. They're just, and then they decide that their hands are clean and they start touching everything. You want to make sure that people know how to don and doff these things, and whether you anticipate that they're going to throw them away. If you allow people to bring their own face coverings, what are you going to require those to look like? What standards are you going to apply? If somebody decides that they don't want to do this, what are you going to do with that person? And then I cannot overemphasize this enough: training, and daily communication about this. So you can't expect, the average person, I think, has to hear something 6 times before they actually know it. So this is really new information for people, and there might be some resistance. We've had good messaging from the governor's office in terms of wear masks, and that's another reason tone from the top is so important. But start communicating now about what you're going to require, and then know that there's going to be a learning curve for your employees. And then spacing, as I mentioned, how are you going to space people out? How are you going to manage a positive test in your workplace? Either Christina or Sean's going to talk about that next. Quarantine that person? Are you going to do contact tracing? Are you going to require a doctor's note to come back? That sort of thing. And then the third P is your policies. So things are changing in your workplace. Your attendance is going to change, or is changing. You have new sick leave. You have new cleaning protocols. All of this stuff is new. So you need to create additional and review your existing policies to decide what needs to change. So you don't want a lot of conflict in your policies. The first thing you should look at also is to make sure that you have a Families First Coronavirus Response Act set of leave policies that look at the new Family Leave Act and the Sick Leave Act, or sick leave under that act. You want to review your existing sick policies to make sure that they refer back to that. Your leave policies, are you going to loosen that up a little bit, particularly because people likely don't have childcare right now, and they have schooling duties as well. You need to look at your emergency plans and make sure that those sort of foresee something that could happen under this plan. Let's say you do have an outbreak, you need to close. How are you going to communicate that? Or you have a sick person, you need to figure out who has had contact with them. You need to be able to communicate with your employees. Have good backup plans if someone is out sick. Everyone knows the chain of command. And then remote work policies, make sure that those are up to date. You want to make sure your employee contacts and emergency list is good. Protocols for cleaning, all of that. And then tracking attendance. And I mentioned this earlier, this is not a wage and hour concern. And so if you have time clocks and people punching in, this is pretty easy. But if you have a more salaried staff or workforce, then you need to start somehow tracking their attendance and what they're doing now, so that you know if there is any exposure, that you can notify people. Next slide, please. Thanks. Who are you going to communicate this with? Your employees, obviously. Your vendors and your customers and your landlord are also important considerations, so that they know that, one, you're taking this seriously, you have everyone's safety in mind, and that you also want to have their safety, or you want them to have your safety in mind. So you don't want your vendors coming in knowingly sending someone in sick, or maybe not really even caring. Are you going to require your vendors to wear masks, for example? That sort of thing. How frequently you're going to communicate. We recommend daily. At least for a while, these things need to be daily, and so people know what to do, and it's part of, I need to wear a mask when I do this. I need to make sure that I take my gloves off this often, that sort of thing. You need to document, send out documents on a regular basis, make sure that people sign the policies, that they've read them. Regular written communication for people who don't get oral communication that well. And if you're in an environment that has more written communication. And then safety huddles. I'll talk about that in the next slide in a second. Team discussions, phone calls, Zoom calls, that sort of thing. And you want to be consistent. So you want to have a set of guidelines for disciplining employees, and you want to make sure that that's going to apply top down, so that maybe also so that your favorite employee is not allowed to gallivant around without a mask, while the disfavored employees all have to wear masks. I mean, that feels punitive, and it will create a bad situation. Next slide. Training on this is really important. And as I said, it's probably going to change. So people already have COVID-19 fatigue, and people are going to have a little bit more fatigue when they're in the office or the business, and plans are changing. So message that you are a member of this team too, that you are all in the same boat, and everyone is having to roll with the punches here and figure out how to deal with this and make the workplace safe. And that's going to change, and the virus is probably going to change too. So there are going to be changes. You want to have daily team meetings and safety huddles. This is really important as a tool, and those of you who are in a more construction-oriented industry probably have these, or a safety, like safety huddles and meetings. You want to remind everyone about the safety issues, so constant training, mask, what you're anticipating that they're going to wear, masks, gloves. You'll be able to talk about issues that have arisen or tips, and employees will be able to discuss any feedback or ask questions and provide their own tips to each other. And so here's another documentation point, is that you'll want to write down who is there, the issues that were discussed, how long the meeting was, that sort of thing. And then you'll want to document who gets the policies, make sure that everyone signs the policies. And then any documentation of any other kind that you want to keep. If you're going to do temperature checks, again, make sure that those are set aside confidential. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Susan. We're going to talk now about following relevant guidance. And I want to be real quick, because I think these are things that are, we can go over this pretty quickly, and I want to make sure we have time for Christina to talk about temperature check and other symptom checking. So essentially, your reopening plan should account for and follow relevant guidance. And the guidance that we have is from the Centers of Disease Control, That's the CDC that has guidance on social distancing and cleaning standards. There's a whole bunch of approved cleaners that you can find on the CDC's website that help you know which cleaners can be used to clean hard surfaces that might have been exposed to the COVID-19 virus. OSHA also has guidelines, specifically industry-specific guidelines. So that's another place you need to check. And then also need to check state and local guidance. The state of Utah has done, I think, quite a good job of giving us guidelines about when we move from the stages of red to orange to yellow to green, about what businesses need to be thinking about in terms of how to protect their employees and how to protect their customers. So that information is available on the state's website, and something that you need to be checking on and making sure that you're following in order to reopen your business. Okay, next slide. Essentially, here's a link to the CDC's overall guidance. One of the things, and Susan talks about this, it's important, is make sure you have someone who is a point person to manage and oversee the company's response to COVID-19 and an implementation of the company's plan to COVID-19. Again, the CDC guidance talks about frequent cleaning and disinfecting of workspaces. As part of your plan, you need to make sure that you train your employees how to store and use those cleaning products, and making sure that you maintain social distancing. When this first thing came down, that was the initial guidance from the CDC, and hasn't really changed, and that is to make sure that you keep 6 feet of distance between employees. And whether that requires management of space and also management of workflow, that's something that needs to be considered as part of your plan. Again, OSHA has both general and industry-specific guidance. There is a link in the slide to the OSHA webpage. Some of the standard guidelines that apply to all businesses from OSHA are, they talk about personal protective equipment and chemicals that can be used to clean, developing policies and procedures for prompt identification and isolation of individuals who are infected with COVID-19 or have caught COVID-19, develop and implement and communicate about workplace flexibilities. Again, Susan talked about that in her plan, presentation regarding plans. Make sure that you have included in your plans opportunities for employees to be flexible and flexible work schedules, and alternate when people come in and out to minimize the risk. And then also implementing workplace controls to make sure that you're managing and you're keeping track of what happens and when. And that's one thing that I want to Susan's presentation about creating the importance of documentation. All three of us have been doing employment litigation for many years, and one of the things we always tell employers is that when you're firing an employee, make sure you document make sure you document your reasons. If the reason's not documented, it didn't happen. And I think the same thing is true in this case, because one of the risks that employers have, one of the things that concern employers is if they do reopen, are they going to be liable to employees? Are they going to be liable to customers if they're exposed to COVID-19? The state of Utah has passed a statute that immunize employers from COVID-19 related claims, but there are exceptions to that statute, including intentional misconduct, reckless exposure to risk, or intentional exposure to risk. And so even with that statute, I would not view that statute as kind of a free-for-all and, I can just do things the way I've been doing, and as long as I'm not really, wanton or intentionally trying to expose people to COVID-19, I'm okay. That's not the way to think about it. The way to think about managing the risk is to make sure that you're following CDC guidelines, you're following OSHA guidelines, you're following the local guidelines. And if you do that and you make a good faith effort to do that, then with a backdrop of the statute behind you that gives you immunity for these types of claims, you can feel pretty good about managing that risk of liability for COVID-19 related illnesses and exposure at your workplace. Okay, we're going to now go to Christina, who's going to talk about temperature testing and other symptom checking for employees before bringing them back, and also about vulnerable populations and vulnerable employees.
Thank you, Sean. So yes, I'm going to be talking about screening for COVID-19. And there's really 3 tools that you have, and you should think of these as tools in a big toolbox that you have of things you can do to try to protect your workplace. And these include taking temperatures to screen for fever, asking about symptoms, which Utah has actually said you must do, and asking about potential exposure. Now, obviously, doing all 3 of those things is not going to guarantee that you don't have someone in your workplace with COVID, but it's going to help and certainly eliminate a lot of that risk. Now, in normal times, obviously, you would not be allowed to test employees for their temperature. You wouldn't be able to ask them if they have diseases or certain symptoms, you know, that they would be protected under the American Disabilities Act. But these are very unusual times, obviously, and the CDC, the federal government, and now the Utah state government is telling us that we should be asking people about symptoms, and we should consider doing temperature checking or having employees do their own temperature checking so that we can try to reduce these risks in our workplace. Okay, next slide. Now, if you're going to do any of these things, you should be doing at least asking about symptoms, and I would suggest, highly suggest, you know, consider doing temperature taking. You should keep a log of the temperatures, or at least the ones that are above the threshold, because you have to have a log, basically documentation, like we've been talking about, of those who don't pass and any exposure that people are reporting. But it's really critical that you know that this information has to be confidential. It is medical information about people, and you have to keep this on a confidential basis in a separate file and only shared with those who really need to know the information. It's also important that it not be discriminatory. I think like Susan talked about in another area, you can't just choose certain people to test or to screen. You really have to include everyone. So that's why you need to have a policy now that says this is who's going to be tested, these are the circumstances, and this is the threshold, which if someone is over that threshold, they'll be considered not passing the screening. Next slide. Now, to start with, when you're creating your policy for temperature taking, you should set a criteria, because you don't want to get in a position where you're starting to take temperatures and you're trying to decide in that moment, okay, well, is that too high? Is that one too low? You need to decide in advance. This is the cutoff. If someone has a temperature that exceeds this, they will not be allowed in the workplace. Now, the CDC says that if you have a temperature of 100.4, you have a fever and you shouldn't be in the workplace. So at a minimum, that should be your criteria. Some employers are choosing to go even a little bit lower. I've seen people go as low as 100. So just having a definite cutoff that you consistently apply. Now, in terms of symptoms and asking employees about symptoms, the new Utah guidelines, from going to red to orange, say that employers must ask about symptoms. And there's a lot of ways to do this. You can get I think it's called the Healthy Together app. I have that on my phone. It's a really easy way. You can have all your employees get that and answer the questions. There's other apps. You could create an online survey. You could ask them in person over the telephone, other ways where you're staying distant from them. But just keep in mind that these symptoms do change over time. And you can see on this list, these are the current CDC symptoms. But it used to be, we really were just concerned about cough, shortness of breath, and fever. And now they've added these additional symptoms. So you need to, think about these, but it has to be at least 2 in the bottom list. I kind of always have a sore throat, especially if it's ever allergy season. And for me, it's almost always allergy season. So, that's why you have to have 2 of those. But, keep on top of that, make sure your policy is up to date. Next slide. It's also a good idea to ask employees about exposure. Again, this could be part of an app. It could be part of an online survey that you provide employees before they come to work every morning, or you could just require them to report if they've had close contact with someone who has tested positive, if they've traveled to a high risk area, those sorts of things. You want to just make sure that anyone who has been exposed is kept out of the workplace for 14 days. Now, if you do decide to do temperature checking, there are really two options. You can have people do it themselves at home and then, make sure they don't have a temperature before they come to work. That might be easier for some workplaces. Or you could do it at work where basically the employer is administering the temperature taking in some place. So those are two options and probably different for, different kinds of workplaces. Now, once you decide on what sort of temperature training temperature taking you're going to do, you need to make sure that you train everyone on, what the policies and procedures are, how they should do it, what counts as too high of a temperature. You need to make sure that employees have access to thermometers and anything else they need. If you're going to be doing it at work, there's other things you're going to need as well. But even if they're going to be doing it at home, they need to have the app. If you're going to use an app, they're going to need to have a computer if you're going to have an online survey. So you need to start thinking about that now. What do people need? Do they have it? And do people understand what the procedure is for doing it at home? Are they just going to do it themselves and just report that there's no temperature, or report to you if they do have a temperature? Are you going to require them to take a photo of the temperature reading, or do a Zoom or FaceTime check-in with you? You need to decide in advance how that's going to work. And just depending on the risk of the risk that you have in your workplace, you might decide to go a different way with that. If you are going to do temperature taking at work, you need to decide who is going to do the temperature taking. And the most ideal thing is to have, hire one of these companies that have home health nurses come into your workspace. They do the temperature taking, they're trained, that's great. Not everyone can afford that or even, has it available. If that's not an option, you might see if someone in your workplace has some medical training. Is there someone who's an EMT or does have nurse training or something where they can, be a more helpful person to be in charge of that? If not, you're just going to have to get someone up to speed, get them trained. There are a lot of online training videos they can watch to make sure that they know what they're doing. And then whoever's doing the temperature taking, they need to wear masks, other PPE, because they're going to be exposed to a lot of people. There's some infrared scanners that you can get 6 feet away, but very few. For the most part, they're going to probably have to get closer than 6 feet to people, so they need to be protected. Now, I hope it's been obvious that one of the things you need to do is start right now in terms of any equipment procurement you need. If you have not already ordered thermometers, cleaning supplies for thermometers, masks, cones, if you're going to be doing some sort of drive-through temperature taking, you've got to get those things now. They're in short supply. I ordered a thermometer for home a few months ago when this was all starting to sort of come down. It came last Friday, and I put batteries in it, and it started smoking and completely fizzed out. It was from China, so I don't know. But so now I don't even have a thermometer for my own house. So if I had to do at home temperature taking, I don't even have a working thermometer. So, this is something we all need to be thinking about, getting these things so that we, can engage in this sort of testing as soon as we need to. Okay, next slide. And of course, if you do temperature checking at work, you need to make sure that you're keeping up with all the CDC guidelines. They apply, which means social distancing, not having crowds. You can't have everyone come to work, show up in a group, stand in a big line and have their temperature taken, where they're all together. That would be violating all the rules. You've got to figure out how to do this so that they're staggered, they're social distancing. You don't have crowds, you're cleaning equipment. All the health guidelines have to be followed with temperature checking as well. Okay, next slide. In terms of at-work testing, there's a few different ways you could do it. The CDC recommends that you have people tested before they come into the workplace so that you set something outside of your facility if that's possible. And again, making sure there's not crowding, that you have physical distancing. Some bigger workplaces are setting up drive-through screening, using traffic controls and signs and all of that to keep people protected. Some bigger employers are setting up trailers where they're doing this. You can have people come inside your facility if that's really your only option, but then again, make sure that they're washing their hands, that they're using physical distancing. I've put some concepts up here to think about in terms of making sure that you're keeping people safe. You don't want to create more danger through the testing that already exists. And then if you've got to think now about what your policy is going to say if someone fails to pass. Failing to pass meaning they have a temperature, or they report the symptom, one or more of the symptoms on the symptom list, or they report exposure. If any of those things occur, they should not be allowed to come into work. And you should have guidelines about when they can come back to work. And also think about whether there's going to be any remote work available for them while they're being cleared. It could turn out that they don't have COVID-19. They may get tested and maybe they just had something else that gave them a fever or a symptom, or it might turn out that they have that. But you're going to want to follow up with the employee after they're sent home. Find out, did they get medical advice? Did they get tested? And make sure you're keeping that information very confidential. But if other people at work have been exposed to them, you are going to have to notify, without using their name, the people who have been exposed. Next slide. Now, the return to work procedure is pretty important, and there's a lot of detail here, so I'll just let you look at that. But there's really two different scenarios where the CDC says that you can return to work after you've basically failed the screenings that we've talked about. It's either the first scenario is the symptoms, there's enough time after the symptoms go by, or documentation from a medical provider. But you want to make sure that those are strictly followed and people are not coming back to work until they're safe to do so. Now, once you have a plan and a procedure, you're going to want to have a written policy that describes all of these things. This is something we can help with if you need that. Susan and Sean have talked about choosing a facilitator. You'd want a facilitator to run this program. Communication to employees obviously is very important. Some employees don't want to use apps about their symptoms. Some people don't want to take their temperatures. There's going to be some pushback. So lots of communication about why you're doing this, why it's important, how it's protecting everyone. Do training and do a dry run, because if you don't do a dry run, you're not going to realize what some of the snags are with your systems. I suggest doing that if you can before people come back to work. Also keep in mind that if you have hourly employees, they have to be compensated for their screening time. And in the end, if they refuse to be tested or refuse to provide answers to the screening questions, you can take disciplinary action, even letting them go. But take these things very slowly. Don't jump right into firing someone. A lot of people have concerns. There's lots of different information out there. Try to be gentle, bring people along, help people understand why you have policies and procedures. Now, one of I think the most important things in this phase is protecting vulnerable populations. I think we've all realized that we probably can't be shut down for 2 years, that we do need to go back to work. And yet there's a lot of people who, if they get COVID-19, they're going to get really sick. We're talking about older people, people with certain health conditions. And so it's really important in this phase to figure out how we can get back to work and yet protect these people. And the Utah guidance in particular from the governor's office has said that employers must try to protect vulnerable populations. Now, the guidance mostly talks about protecting vulnerable employees, but you do have to think about the fact that some people coming into your workplace go back home and they live with people who are vulnerable. So if they catch it at work and they go home and they give it to their grandmother or they give it to their child with asthma, that can also be a problem. So you have to think about that. Now, the vulnerabilities that are at least listed by the Utah guidance are those who are 65 or older, or have some immunity issues, and then have any one of these lists of diseases. This list is changing all the time. So again, you need to stay informed about what the vulnerabilities are, because as this virus spreads, we're getting more data about who's impacted. Now, as I mentioned, as we're going from red to orange, the governor's office has said that one of the most important things is protecting vulnerable people. And the guidance says that vulnerable people should still practice extreme caution. And look at this bottom one. It says that special accommodations for these employees should be made in the workplace if they are unable to work from home. That's what the governor's office has said. It's a little unclear what this means in terms of, what do employers have to do, or what if they can't accommodate? But as at least the first thing you have to think about is that you should try to accommodate people with vulnerabilities and do whatever you can to make them as safe as possible. the law limits what you can do. You can't treat people that are 65 or older differently, or pregnant people differently, or people with health conditions differently, because these can constitute discrimination. For example, you couldn't just say, oh, well, these people should stay home, we're not going to bring them back. You can't exclude them from the workplace and say now they don't have jobs because you want to protect them. That would be discrimination. So I'm telling you, you're supposed to protect them on the one hand, and yet you can't keep them out of your workplace. So what do you do to protect these people? And there's a variety of things you can think about, and every employer is different. If they can continue to telework, that is the ideal thing, because they can stay at home and quarantine. Allow other flexibility if possible. You can, some of my clients have been doing volunteer programs for who comes back to work. If you need a limited staff back to work, but some people can still work at home, that might be one thing to consider. You can ask people, not ask them, you can't ask them if they have any underlying conditions, but you can let them know that they can self-disclose and let you know that they do have a vulnerability, and that if they do that, you will do everything you can to try to accommodate them. And some of the other things are listed on my slides about what you might want to do if you have a vulnerable person, in terms of extra cleaning, extra considerations about their shift, who they're working with, taking them out of customer-facing jobs or out of jobs where they have to interact with a lot of people. Next slide. So as I mentioned, you can't ask an employee directly because of the ADA if they have a disability. But they can just self-disclose that they have a disability. And one thing that employers are doing a lot of right now are writing new policies that say, we encourage you to let us know if you have one of these underlying conditions. And if they do let you know, it's just what you normally have to do under the ADA. If you have at least 15 employees, you have to have a conversation with them about what you can do to help them, to accommodate them in the workplace. What specific things they're concerned about, and, doing some extra things to help them, if it's plexiglass or, extra distancing, that sort of thing, to make sure that they're safe. And then, I get the question a lot from employers, what if an employee refuses to work? They just say, I don't want to come back to work. This is too dangerous. I'm concerned about this. You do have a right to fire that person if they absolutely refuse to come to work and they don't have a reason for doing so. They don't have, a reason to have leave, or they don't have a vulnerable condition that allows them to ask for an accommodation. But I still would say that you need to proceed cautiously, talk to the employee, find out why they don't want to come back to work. Maybe they don't understand everything you're doing to protect them. Listen for concerns that they might be raising about ADA, which means some sort of disability, medical condition, so that if they do have that, you can ask them about it. You can do the interactive process that you're required to do. But like I said, in the end, if they're simply scared and they don't truly have a need for an accommodation, you're going to have to take action. But I would really suggest that you talk to counsel in that situation. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Christina. I'm just going to be really quick because I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. So personal protective equipment, we're talking about things such as masks. And you can look at the slides when we send them out. Essentially, the bottom line is that the state of Utah, in moving from red to orange, has recommended that employers provide masks to their employees if social distancing can't be accommodated. So if you have a situation where you can't have employees that are staying, the appropriate distance from each other, 6 feet, that you provide them with masks. And my recommendation to all employers is, even if you can accommodate social distancing, I would still recommend that employers provide their employees with masks so that they can limit the transmission of COVID-19 in the workplace. I think it's just the best practice at this point in this pandemic. So we can, that's kind of just the bottom line takeaway. There's also what are called things that are called respirators, which are the N95 masks. Those are generally not required for most employers. They're only required for healthcare providers. Okay, we can just skip to these next slides, Jason. So yeah, again, one of the things to think about when you're talking about masks is making sure that you are sensitive to employees who might need accommodations in wearing those masks and wearing, or because of disability or because of religion. There might be some folks that say, I need an accommodation. They might have sensitivities to certain products, and so their masks need to be of another type of material rather than, for example, plastic or cloth or something. Just need to be sensitive to. Some employees might have religious or disability accommodation requests. So one thing with testing, so we're just going to talk, again, I'll let you go through these slides. We'll leave a couple of minutes for questions. The bottom line takeaway with regard to an employee who tests positive for COVID-19. So if you've got an employee who is positive for COVID-19, the first thing you need to do, obviously, is send that employee home. Do not let them come in the workplace and make them follow the CDC guidelines about returning to work. They need to stay home for at least 14 days. They shouldn't return to work until some of those conditions that Christina mentioned in her presentation are met. Either they are symptom-free for a certain period of time, or they have a doctor certification. Then you need to also strongly recommend that you contact trace with that employee for that employee. So in other words, what other employees has the infected employee been interacting with over a certain period of time? So you want to make sure that you can trace out who else might be infected. And then with those employees who might be infected, it's a strong recommendation, if you can, to have them stay at home, have them self-quarantine or have themselves get tested so they can come back and confirm to you, yeah, even though I was potentially exposed to, to Joe who had COVID-19, I tested negatively, so I can come back to work. And make sure you have those policies about how you're going to go about doing the contact tracing and how you're going to go about letting people come back to work. Not only, and that includes not only the employees who tested positive, but also the employees who might have been sent home because they had interactions with and had contact with the infected individual. Again, that's kind of the takeaway. I wanted to leave some time for questions. One of the questions I saw come up on the chat line is if we can talk more about the Utah statute, and I'm happy to talk about that. That statute was passed a few weeks ago. Essentially what the statute is designed to do is designed to let employers and companies be immune, essentially, that people can't sue them if that person contracts COVID-19 at the workplace. So if you have a customer at a restaurant that says, I contracted COVID-19 at the workplace, or if you have an employee at a retail shop or any kind of employer, a place of work, that they contract COVID-19 and they want to sue the employer saying you didn't keep the workplace clean, or you didn't keep your restaurant clean or your retail store clean, and I contracted COVID-19, or my mother contracted COVID-19 and passed away, you should be liable. And the reason why that statute came up is, beginning about a month ago, we started to see lawsuits across the country crop up where employers and businesses were being sued. There was a well-known retailer in Illinois that was sued by employees because the employer claimed that they didn't have proper cleaning procedures for COVID-19. Customers have brought lawsuits. And so the state legislature and the state government saying we're trying to encourage employers and companies to open, but if they open, then they might get sued if someone contracts COVID-19. So that was the design of the statute, is to give employers and companies some level of comfort that they could open up for business and not be subject to liability from employees and customers. However, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a free-for-all. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. And any employer or company who thinks that it is walking past the graveyard, because there are exceptions to the immunity. Those exceptions include willful misconduct, or intentionally inflicting harm or recklessly inflicting harm. So there are carve-outs, and I can tell you, and Christina and Susan as well can tell you, we've litigated for many years. There are always creative arguments that can be made by plaintiffs' attorneys to try to get around these types of exceptions and try to fit into one of those exceptions that the statute carves out for employer liability. So as I said at the outset, the best practice is to make sure that you are following the guidelines that we've outlined today. Make sure you create a plan. Make sure you're potentially temperature testing and symptom checking before you bring people back. Make sure you're following CDC, Osha, and local guidelines. And if you do that, you can have a high degree of confidence that even if you have an employee who contracts COVID-19, or even if you have a customer who contracts COVID-19, that you are going to be, you're unlikely to be held liable as a matter of tort, a matter of tort law, and that you're going to, that claim is not going to, you're not going to be tagged with a significant judgment or liability for someone contracting COVID-19. You kind of, and I want to just, I know we're out of time, but I want to just kind of end with one comment again, and that is, go back to what I said earlier. There's going to be companies that survive and thrive after this, and there's going to be companies that don't. And as I said before, I think the difference is going to be companies that are willing to adapt. I had a conversation with a client a few days ago, and that client was looking at a lease renewal for its office space, and the client told me, I'm not going to do it. Teleworking is working just fine. And so, and we're not losing any efficiency with our employees. So we're going to keep on teleworking, and we're not going to renew the lease. So they're looking at this, they're taking this pandemic as an opportunity to reduce their overhead, reduce their costs. And that's a company that I think is going to thrive and prosper out of this, because they're being adaptive. They're not saying, well, we have to go back and do things the way we've always done them. They're looking for opportunities to change their business model, change how they do things, to lower costs and to thrive in this environment. And so it's not all doom and gloom. And that's, I guess, the message I wanted to leave with. This is not all doom and gloom. There are opportunities to be had for companies to thrive and survive in this environment. Well, I'm happy to stay after. If anyone has additional questions, I'm sure Susan and Christina are as well. But thank you for your participation, and thank you for signing up and listening to us today.
Oh, thank all of you, Susan, Christina, Jason, Sean. We really appreciate this valuable information. Any of you who have to depart, we understand. I would like to follow up with one question, and it probably goes to more what Christina was talking about. And there are protections for those who are vulnerable in keeping their jobs and working at home. One of the things that have come up, though, with a lot of the parents, and I know there's a lot of parents on this call who are staying at home to work because their children are at home. And I have heard talk that a lot of school districts are talking about maybe splitting a day and doing half the students in the morning, half in the afternoon. If this comes to fruition, what kind of protections are there for parents whose employers want them to go back to work, but they have no choice but to stay home and be with their kids? Is there any discussion regarding that?
The only thing there is right now is when the Response Act was passed, the federal government created some leave rights, paid leave rights for employees that apply to all employers under 500. And it provides the first 80 hours, you get 2/3 of pay, up to $200 a day. And then the next 10 weeks, parents who are at home because their kids are out of care because of COVID also get some pay with some caps every day. Right now, that's all there is, and that's not going to get us through forever. The good thing for employers is that that's really a tax pass-through. You get to deduct those payments you make to employees on your payroll taxes. So that's good. But long-term, we need to come up with a better solution. Anyone else have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I would just interject. I mean, part of also in the regulations in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which Christina referred to as Response Act, there is encouragement from the government to have a dialogue between employees and employers about intermittent leave. And I think what I would take that to and I would try to use that to have a dialogue with employees and say, okay, let's try to come up with part-time or flexible work schedules that you can work from home, so you can kind of combine the ability to take care of your child whose school is closed or might be intermittently closed, and you might be intermittently working. I think a dialogue between employers and employees is really important. And there's with this new teleworking, I think there is a lot of flexibility that employers can take advantage of, because as Christina said, the rights of the employee to take leave to take care of a child whose school or daycare has been closed is limited to 12 weeks. And this is going to last longer than 12 weeks.
Right. Thank you so very much.
One more thing about that, Carla.
Yes.
Some of my clients are starting to think about offering their employees the option of working 2 days a week or 3 days a week or a half day, just creating a lot more flexibility than we normally would think about, because we're in such a tough situation and they're going to lose employees. If you don't do that, you're going to lose employees. So you really have to be creative, and you have to have conversations with your employees about what they need. You may not realize what sort of issues they're dealing with in terms of parenting.
Good
Can I
advice.
throw in one more question here that was asked? I think it's a good one. Whether or not employers should consider making some changes to their interview, hiring, and onboarding process for new employees.
Anyone want to address? I mean, I have some thoughts. Christina,
Yeah.
Susan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that, and some of these are sort of distance, kind of, onboarding, depending on what portion you're talking about it. But interviewing, I think, is the easiest way, or the easiest part of this to deal with in terms of Zoom interviews. Those are becoming so much more common now anyway, that I think that this is going to seal the deal in terms of those being kind of standard ways to interview people. You don't need to fly people out necessarily, and definitely not now. In terms of the onboarding process and training, you're going to have to start implementing at an early level, masks and distancing and that sort of thing. Does anyone have, and in terms of the social distancing concerns and the spread of COVID-19 concerns, anyone else?
You can do onboarding completely virtually now because
Right.
the federal government has even eased restrictions in terms of getting I-9 documentation. They have a policy now where you can do that basically virtually. You don't have to have the person present their I-9 documentation in person. So if this goes on and we can't come together for a while, there are some options for doing that. And as much as you can do that, I would suggest you do.
It was noted in the chat too that SHRM has some, extensive resources regarding changes in HR policies and practices. So might be something good to look up there as well.
Great. All right. Well, to be cognizant of everyone's time, thank you so very much. And I'm sure that you are all okay with anyone reaching out if they have any further questions. We will pass this on to everyone. And thank you again for this valuable information. Have a great day, everyone.
Great. Thanks,
Our pleasure. Thanks,
Carla.
everyone.
And thanks to all the attendees.